Değerli katılımcılar, Stockholm Şehir Ulaşım Yönetim Direktörü Sayın Profesör Jonas Eliasson'u Şehir Ulaşımında Sorunlar ve Çözümler, Mühendislik, Ekonomi ve Psikoloji adlı konuşmasını yapmak üzere sahneye davet ediyorum, kürsüye davet ediyorum. Dear audience, now I would like to invite dear Director of Stockholm City Transport Department, Professor Jonas Eliasson for his speech, Challenges and Solutions in Urban Transport, Combining Engineering, Economics and Psychology.
Very much. Thank you so much. Nice to be here. Let's see. Well, this was a bit hard. Well, anyway. There's the clicker. Thank you so much. Can you hear me when I walk around like this? Yes, you can, I suppose. Hi, it's nice. You know, I am in the transportation business, so it feels much better, more natural to be walking around like this instead of just standing there. So, my name is Jonas Eliasson. I'm a professor of transport systems analysis at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm. But I'm right now actually on part-time leave of absence to be the director for the Stockholm City Transportation Administration for a couple of years, which is, of course, an extremely interesting job for an academic like myself to actually be able to put some of my experience and knowledge into practice for Stockholm, for the city of Stockholm right now. Now, cities, of course, they are the foundation of civilization, basically. I mean, all the way from Babylon up until our times, cities have been the prime generators of innovations, productivity, and quality of life. And more people simply want to live in cities. And why is that? Well, because of two things, basically. Economics and quality of life. All kinds of indicators, both of economics and general quality of life, are higher when you have high accessibility. So it's not mainly just about residing in a city, it's about having high accessibility. It's also not about having high levels of transportation, it's about accessing things. So the main challenge of cities is about how to provide maximal accessibility within a confined spatial region. And of course, congestion is basically inevitable. Because if you have a place where many firms and people and activities want to be, then that place will be congested. So a city which is not congested is actually a city which is more or less about to die. So congestion is a sign of life in a city. But on the other hand, managing congestion is of course another thing. Urban land is really the fundamental, scarce and valuable resource. So the problem and the challenge of urban transport policy is essentially about making space-efficient accessibility the key for sustainable growth. Because if you don't construct a system where you have space-efficient accessibility, then in the end you will have a virtual gridlock, a standstill, when everyone wants to travel long distances by personal car rather than, you know, having good accessibility in the end. Okay, so how do we do this? Well, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, but let me just say you something about Stockholm, because Stockholm was, in a way, fortunate enough to have not really good conditions for efficient accessibility. Stockholm is a city built on water, and maybe you have a lot of water in Istanbul as well, but, well, to be honest, we have even more. Stockholm is a city built on islands. And that meant that all from the beginning, all from the 1800s, Stockholm had to build a transportation system which used space as efficiently as possible. Now, I don't think that my forefathers 100 or 200 years ago understood that they were laying the foundations of a transportation system that was going to use space really efficiently. They just had to do this. So in a way, we were rather lucky. We happened to build a city built on public transportation and walking and so on, just because we didn't have any choice. But this means that there are a couple of lessons to be learned from Stockholm, not because we were smarter, just because we were lucky, basically, of having a challenging geography. So despite being a medium-sized city, we are something like 2.5 million people, so not extremely big, but not extremely small either, our congestion levels are actually very high, on par on something like London and Paris, for example, despite being so small, because our bridges and our waters are so thin and challenging. So, well, I think that you can summarize urban transportation policy in 4 basic principles. And I actually came up with this because I was in China, in Beijing, lecturing for a while, and all the other academics there, they had, these marvelous Chinese wisdoms, like, I'm now presenting the 3 pillars of transportation, or this is the 5 dragons' wisdoms. So I had to sort of summarize my findings as well into 4, Swedish principles of efficient urban transport policy. These are the 4. Attractive public transportation, walkability, making sure that it's easy and friendly and attractive to walk in a city, compact planning, not spreading things out, and some kind of restraint on car traffic. And let me just expand on what I mean with this. Well, if you do all of these 4 things, they will tend to strengthen each other. If you focus on just one of them, then it will be rather hard. Because, for example, in order to have attractive public transport, you need to make sure that it's possible to walk in the city. Because if you can't walk, then you can't walk from the final station of public transportation. And of course, if you don't have attractive public transportation, then trying to restrain car traffic is virtually impossible. You need to have that as well. And of course, if you don't have compact planning, then you can't walk either, because the distances between the buildings and the distance between the parts of the town will be so long, so people can't walk. So you need to have all 4 of them. And if you're lucky, then you have a rather old city, like Istanbul, for example, and these cities which are old, they tend to be centered around walking, because walking was the original human mode of transportation, of course. Whereas the new cities of the Third World, the new cities of the USA, they are often, unfortunately for them, built on car transportation. And we can all see the results of that now. Now, attractive public transportation. Well, I saw the marvelous buses out there, for example. So I think that I don't have to tell you about attractive public transportation. We all know this. But I think that the key is to understand that we need to focus on all of these things. Easy to use and understand, easy to orient in. It needs to be fast, have high frequency, be punctual and reliable, have high density in terms of that the walking distance to the stations need to be rather short. It needs to be comfortable, and it also needs to be affordable. I didn't say cheap, but I say that it needs to be affordable in the sense that it needs to provide good value for money for all kinds of people. Some wise person once said that a sign of a high welfare country is not. It's a place where even the rich bankers go by public transportation. And in that sense, Stockholm is actually a rather nice example. I mean, everyone goes by public transportation, more or less anyway, when they travel in rush hour to the inner city. The public transport share in Stockholm in rush hours in the inner parts of the city is something like 80%. 80%. The remaining 20% is mainly professional traffic. So going by public transportation in Stockholm is like the fundamental default option. And of course, our public transportation system can be improved in many ways. That's what my job is about, essentially. But some of the basic building blocks are there in place. And then walking, of course. For some reason, we sometimes forget that creating attractive and good walking environments doesn't come by itself. And I think that we are so used to having walkable city cores. I mean, being cities which is, roughly 1,000 years old. Of course, they were made for walking. But when you look at the outskirts of the city, those parts of the city being built right now, or if you look at the new cities of China and India, or the USA for that matter, you can see that it's easy to forget to create an environment which is possible to walk in. If you go to Beijing, for example, they have a wonderful public transportation system. But when you leave the metro station, it's almost impossible to cross the street. You get killed by all these cars and things moving around there. So they have almost forgotten, despite being such an old civilization, that walking is really the fundamental, original human mode of transportation. And of course, it's nice. It's nice, right? I mean, if you go to Istanbul, you want to go to Hagia Sophia and the Topkapi Palace and just walk around and feel like a human being has been. I mean, we were made for walking. The last 2 million years or so, we've been walking. But sometimes we as transportation planners, we forget to plan for walking in exactly the same serious and careful manner as we plan things like public transportation and car traffic. Now, another nice picture. Cycling, I need to say something about cycling, because cycling is perhaps one of the most exciting trends right now. And it feels a little bit strange to say that cycling is the most exciting trend. I mean, this is mode of transportation, which is, 120 years old or something. But cycling is increasing very fast in many cities of the world, especially in Stockholm, for example. Cycling is now our second most common mode of transport in rush hours, actually even more common than going by car. And what's also important is that it's nowadays becoming more and more perceived as like a status symbol. I mean, being able to cycle to work, for example, in downtown, that means two things. You are healthy and want to be perceived as young. I mean, it's not just old people who cycle, but it's a sign of health. And it's also a sign that if you cycle to your job downtown, that means that you can afford to live in an apartment which is so close to downtown so you can cycle to it. So this is actually a much more, a way to brag about your own health and brag about your own income. Much more efficient as a bragging sign than going by car. Because in Stockholm, obviously, everyone can afford a car. That's not something special. Everyone has a car if they want to. But being able to cycle to work, well, that's something. Especially if you do that like this guy, you cycle in a nice suit and everything, I cycle to work. So this is partly behind the reason behind the trend of cycling in Stockholm and Copenhagen and Amsterdam and many other cities. And of course, it's fast. It's by far the fastest mode of transportation for medium-sized distances. I mean, between 5 and 15 kilometers. If you go by bicycle, it's by far the fastest one. And of course, it's equitable. I mean, everyone can afford to take a bicycle, right? If you want to have this guy has some kind of electric bike, which is kind of expensive, but if you want to, you can get the bike for free, more or less. So this is also one of the examples of a really space-efficient mode, which can create lots of accessibility within a very confined region. Especially if you look like this. I mean, we nowadays have quite a lot of congestion on the bike lanes. So we're trying to widen the capacity of the bike lanes in Stockholm just to be able to cope with this increase in bicycling traffic. Well, compact and transit-oriented planning. This is perhaps one of the hardest part, because if you hadn't planned like this right from the start, it can be very hard to sort of retrofit a city like this. Now, Stockholm was fortunate enough to build its land use structure according to commuter train services and the metro line. But what happened in the 1950s was that the city built the metro lines and then constructed the land use patterns around the metro stations. So you can see here, let's see, maybe this one? No? Okay, I'll do it like this instead. I wonder if you can step on this. Famous last words. Okay, I managed, good. Well, you can see the commuter train lines going up until this, and you can also see how the land use are concentrated along these main public transport corridors, all the way this down, all the way this way, all the way this way, and to the northeast and right up until the north. And if we would be able to zoom in on this picture, then you could also see that the land use is also concentrated around the stations. So you can see that the high-density buildings are all along the metro stations and the commuter railway stations. And of course, if you plan it this way, then that's basically the only way that public transport will be the sort of the default alternative for traveling, which is the only way to solve congestion in the downtown area, especially if you see all the water there. Finally then, restraints on car traffic. Well, car is a wonderful mode of transportation if you have the space for it. I mean, it's fast. Nowadays, it's not not very expensive anyway. It's rather expensive, but not very expensive. It goes from door to door. It leaves exactly at the time that you want to. You can bring your friends and bring luggage and everything. So it's a wonderful mode of transportation, right? But it takes a lot of space, and it also generates emissions. In terms of emissions, I think that technological development will mean that maybe 10 or 15 years from now, emissions will be a much smaller problem than it is right now, but right now it is still a major problem for most cities. But congestion won't go away, even if you have self-driving cars and electric cars and so on. So you need to make sure that the benefits of car accessibility is weighed against the costs, the disutilities and the disadvantages of cars taking up so much space. And cars are also a problem in the sense that, to be frank, I mean, it makes cities a little bit less attractive. I mean, an attractive city in the urban core is somewhere where you can walk around and sit and rest and talk to people, and having, 50,000 cars driving by every day, that makes the city much less attractive. So that in itself is a problem. And of course, trying to balance the benefits against disadvantages means that you want to make sure that you are not on the high-rise end of the curve there. Because once you get above a certain level, congestion starts to increase really rapidly. But that's also the other way around. If you're able to decrease traffic just by something like 10 or 15%, that can have a huge effect of urban congestion. And this brings me to the Stockholm congestion charges. The Stockholm introduced congestion pricing, this favorite policy measure among transport economists and transport planners all the way from 1960s. We've all been suggesting this, we've all been analyzing this all the way from the 1920s, but especially from the 1960s, 1970s, and so on. But very few cities have dared or managed to actually introduce it. Stockholm introduced congestion charges first actually as a trial in 2006, which was a rather brave political move, actually. And there's a long political history which I can't go into, but anyway. And this trial was then followed by a referendum, which is almost incredible. I mean, you can imagine all the political struggles that went into this. The system is roughly consisting of a cordon around the inner city, where you pay €2 per crossing in peak hours, both directions, and €1 in middays, and it's also a rather complicated time differentiation, but I won't go into that. It's free of charge, evenings and weekends, and we just recently revised this design slightly in January 2016, but I'll mostly talk about the original design. So, now what happened? Well, there are two questions about congestion charges, which all decision makers ask themselves and ask the experts. The first one is, does it work? Will it actually reduce congestion? And the second one is, will I be re-elected? Will they hate me afterwards? I mean, even if it works, I want to have a decent chance of winning the next re-election. Well, let me first say that a key of this is technology. You need to have free-flow toll gantries. You can't have, toll plazas which just clog up the road and use a lot of space. You need free-flow identifications with a convenient payment system, something like monthly bills sent to vehicle owners or deduct automatically and so on. So it's a really simple system. And as you can see, I mean, it doesn't really take up a lot of road space either. And basically, it works. The blue bars here are the traffic entering and exiting the inner city without congestion charges, and the red ones are average annual traffic with congestion charges. And you can see here, I need to point again, oops, yeah. Traffic in the inner city had been stable for something like 15 or 20 years because we just couldn't squeeze more traffic into the inner city for many, many years. This is the congestion charging trial. On the first day of the trial, and staying stable all over the trial, traffic across the cordon dropped by 20% immediately. 20%. And I was actually in charge of making the forecasts. And the forecasting model said, well, 20%. And I was like, it's never going to be 20%. That's just a huge figure. But maybe we can reach the target of 10%. And then the figures came in, 20% reduction, all over the border. And I was like, okay, so obviously the transport model is smarter than I am or have a better gut feeling than I do. So the lesson here is, trust your transport models if they are good. Now, after the referendum, the trial was set up in such a way that the congestion charge was then taken away again. So the blue bars here are the 2.5 years after the referendum. And then, since the referendum was won, the charges were then reintroduced again. And you can see all the years from then, traffic has remained roughly stable. So it's not the case that traffic comes back. It actually stays at these rather low levels. Now, 20% then, is that a lot? Well, I just said it was a lot, but what does it look like? Well, it looks like this. It looks like this. It was a complete revolution. I've never seen anything like this. This used to be one of Stockholm's most congested arterials right through the inner city. And this picture shows you the last day without congestion charges. And this is the first day with congestion charges. And we were totally unprepared for this. I was actually standing making TV interviews on the bridge over there the last day before the congestion charges. And I said that, yeah, we're going to have this huge evaluation program, and we'll have all the figures and all the data ready by midsummer, after half a year, and then we'll see if we can see anything. And the first day I was like, well, the numbers aren't in yet, but I think that we can safely assume that something has happened here. It was just an immense change. Now, we also have lots of other figures, and basically we can say that around 30 to 50% less queuing time on average, depending on the part of the city. And it was not the case that traffic just moved around. It was not the case that traffic moved from the inner city to the suburbs instead. These car trips mainly, well, half of them roughly, went to public transportation, and half of them, they just more or less disappeared. They went into car sharing, fewer trips, other destinations, other departure times. It's hard to pinpoint, actually, but they went to places where they didn't cause congestion. It's also important to know that it also reduced variability. The black solid lines there, they show the travel time variability, the worst days and the last days. And you can see that the variability of travel time, that was reduced even more than the average congestion was. Well, the second question, what did people think? Well, I think that it's safe to say that, I should say it like this. The reason that I'm talking about congestion charges is that it's an interesting example of a controversial transport policy, which transport experts know that this is probably the right thing to do. But how do you set about to do it? Because, even if we are convinced that congestion pricing will work, just the same way as, good BRT systems, underground systems, bicycle lanes, they all work, right? We know that. But how do you do to convince politicians and the public to try this out? Well, I think that you need to prepare for the U-curve of public support. Because when you introduce the idea, people, quite a decent share of public will say that, yeah, maybe, in principle, paying for congestion might sound like a rational idea, right? But when you start introducing the details of the design, then almost inevitably, public support will drop. And you need to survive the valley of political death, which is in the middle there. Because first, public support will drop when they understand the details, and understand that, okay, I will have a charging gantry, right outside my house. I will be the one that pay. And it's one thing to be in principle of the idea in general. It's a completely different thing to say that, okay, I will be prepared to pay or to change my driving patterns. That's another thing. So, when the charges are introduced, public support was much, much lower. But then, when the thing is in place, public support increased a lot. First, it increased to 50%, roughly a bit more than 50%. So the referendum was actually won. And think about that. Stockholm people, who generally don't like to pay for things, they voted to more than 50% to keep a charge which made them, to keep a system which made them pay to go by car. They voluntarily wanted this. And then after a while, it increased even more, up until the final government decision to keep the charges in place. And we nowadays have something like, well, almost 70% of the population in Stockholm are in favor of keeping the congestion system. Now, why is this? Why is this? And why do people change their minds? Well, it's basically two kinds of mechanism. The first one is, it's much better than you thought. Not until you see the benefits and feel the benefits of something like this. It could be congestion pricing, it could be better public transportation, it could be a revised parking scheme, or any other kind of controversial transport policy measure. When you see the benefits, that's when you believe. So it's very hard to convince people to try something out like this unless they've actually seen the benefits. But it's also another thing. It's actually not as bad as you thought. Because what people see when they hear about congestion pricing, they focus on the negative things. I mean, they say, okay, I will pay. My life will come to a standstill. It will be, complete hell. The retail industry will just die, and it will be crowding on the public transport, and all kinds of bad things. And then it turns out that it's actually not so bad. Retail, for example, had no change at all. There was no change whatever in the retail in the inner city. There was no particular crowding in the public transportation because the public transportation was able to cope with it. And of course, most people's daily life just continued as usual. Sure, they paid sometimes, but on the other hand, other days they didn't pay because they didn't drive. So both of these mechanisms are important. But it's also important to know that it has to do with how you communicate things. Well, I should first say that people tend to not be aware about how they change. Because we asked right before, let's say, during the trial, we asked people how much they had changed. And of course, we knew how much traffic had changed because we had measured this. So, but when we asked people, how much have you changed your car driving since half a year ago? Well, the self-reported traffic change was the equivalent of roughly 7% less traffic. But when you look at private traffic, the actual change was something like 30%. And this means that 3 out of 4 disappearing car drivers weren't aware that they had stopped driving. They had changed their car driving behavior without even being aware of it. And why is this? Why is this? Well, it's partly just because people have bad memories. I mean, if you ask people now, how were you traveling 5 or 10 years ago? Well, maybe you are transportation experts. Maybe you know how you used to travel as a whole 10 years ago or 1 year ago. But most people don't know this. They just adapt. So if you do something like this, many more people than you would think will change without even noticing it. And it's also interesting to see that this U-curve in public support, it's there in all groups. I mean, if you look at the bottom line here, those are the people who drive a lot. They pay often, more or less every day. And you can see that these are the ones that were the most negative to begin with. And they became a little bit more negative over here. But when they see the benefits and they understood that when they drive, they actually got a lot less travel time, a lot less congestion, they became more positive as well. So even the ones who pay more or less every day, more than half of them are in favor of keeping the system. But perhaps even more interesting are these two groups. These are the ones who pay very seldomly, maybe once a month or something, or the group who doesn't even have a car. And of course, they are not the ones who perceive the negative benefits. But even for those groups, you see this U-curve. And why is that? Well, it's because that even in Stockholm, people at first don't really trust the government. They hear the government saying that, okay, we will do this new thing. I mean, we'll introduce a charge or whatever. And they don't really trust it. They say that, okay, well, I hear what you're saying. Maybe I'll see what I think. So, and when they then hear about all the negative things that people will project will be happening, even the ones who won't pay, the support for that system will drop. But when they see the benefits and more about that they perceive that the government is actually honest, that the government is actually reliable, and you have an open and public debate about things, that's when the support for these groups who don't really pay increases. So it's really, really important to have this atmosphere where the government is perceived as open and honest and actually does what it says it does. And this does what it says it does is actually one of the key drivers of when you want to introduce some kind of transport policy which is at first perceived as controversial. And this is why I titled the talk, Combining Engineering, Economics, and Psychology. Because engineering, well, that's easy, more or less. I'm actually an engineer by training myself, so I mean, we know engineering, right? Economics, well, it's all about, pricing scarce assets, like space, for example. But psychology, that's where the hard part comes in when you want to do something like this. And there are a couple of things to bear in mind. Well, first, obviously, The system, the policy that you're proposing, it must yield tangible benefits. You need to design the system, if it is the BRT system or the underground or parking pricing or congestion pricing, in a way that actually yields benefits that people can see. The second thing, it needs to be part of a strategy. Remember how I talked about 4 building blocks: public transportation, walkability, compact planning, and restraining car traffic. If you focus on just one of these, it's not part of a strategy. You need to do all of these things, because not until then will people perceive you as honest. It also needs to have a design consistent with a purpose. And I really need to stress this, because if you want to do congestion pricing, you need to price the places in the city where there is congestion. And it's just far too common that cities say that they are introducing congestion pricing, but they are really after the revenues. And people will smell, they will sense if you are really after the revenues rather than the congestion reduction. So if you want to do congestion reductions, don't price roads at night time, for example, if you don't have congestion night time. Don't price roads in a way that will just maximize the yield, maximize the revenues, rather than actually reducing congestion as efficiently as possible. And that means time differentiation, for example. It means targeting a few bottlenecks, for example. It also needs a way to, well, this is a really political matter, because what upsets politicians perhaps the most is when political credits and blame and responsibility are misaligned. If you are the politicians who are brave enough to step out and say that, yes, okay, I think we should try this, we should actually try this, you need to be the politicians which is also in control of the system. Because, for example, if you have a system, which is actually rather common, where the national government is in charge of certain tax revenues, like congestion pricing, for example, whereas the cities are in charge of urban transport policy, then you have a system where someone takes the blame and another one takes the credit. And that doesn't work. And depending on how you have divided the responsibility for different parts of the transport system and different parts of the pricing scheme, this needs to be solved. And this, of course, is a long discussion in political science, which I just skip over right now. Honesty, again, that really helps. If you are uncertain, admit that. Don't exaggerate the benefits in advance, but just be completely open and transparent. And say that, okay, I've heard these experts saying that, for example, congestion pricing is a nice thing to try. We'll try this. I'll trust this expert, but we'll measure everything and we'll be completely open in terms of benefits and costs. And if it doesn't work, I will be prepared to take it away again. Maybe it was a good idea for Stockholm, but not for Istanbul, for example. Or think about new bus lines or new other things. I mean, sometimes, you can't build an underground line and just take it away again, of course. But if you make sure that you are completely open with both the costs, the disutilities, and the benefits, then you have a much better case for convincing the public to trust your ideas. Trials might be a good idea, if it's possible. And this, I think, will also have another idea. I haven't talked about the environment. I just say that all of these ideas which I've presented here also tie in with environmental benefits. By planning the city in this way, Stockholm now has a more than 100 times better air quality today compared to 50 years ago, despite having something like 10 times more cars and 10 times more traffic, for example. And I think that this is actually achievable if you do it the right way. Thanks.
I would like to thank Mr. Jonas Eliasson, and I want to ask you a fifth question. Okay. Değerli misafirler, değerli görüşler için Jonas Eliasson'a teşekkür ediyorum ve Transform paneline geçmeden önce kendine birkaç soru soracağım. What do you think about underground services effect on traffic jam?
Yes, I think it's extremely important to have a very attractive and high-capacity public transportation system to be able to cope with traffic jams. And as I tried to explain, I don't think that you can promise that good public transportation just in itself will solve traffic jams. It will make them less serious, definitely, but you will still have congestion even if you have good public transportation. But good public transportation, that enables you to put some kind of restraint on car traffic. It can be parking charges, it can be smaller road capacity and so on. So you need both of them. But I think that if you don't have a good public transportation system where underground system is typically one of the cornerstones, then it's very hard to do the other things. Now, it also depends on the cost. Underground systems, when you build it under an existing city, can be extremely expensive. It can be extremely expensive. So depending on the cost, it might be good to think about other kinds of public transportation as well, things like BRT systems, for example. But if it's a cost-efficient investment, then definitely.
Thank you very much for your answer. And the other, as an academician, what is your opinion about Istanbul traffic problems?
Yeah, well, I'm not an expert in Istanbul traffic problems, but I actually read something about it. I see that you have spent quite a lot of effort and money in improving your public transportation system just in the last 10 or 15 years, which I think is a very good thing to do. After walking around and looking at Istanbul, it's a marvelous city. To be honest, I, as a pedestrian, feel a little bit, well, cramped, more or less. Maybe there is a little bit too little room for pedestrians, a little bit too much room for car traffic, especially since you have such a wonderful city. I mean, as a pedestrian, I'd like to feel, even more welcome. And after going by taxi for a while like this, going to my hotel, I noticed that the streetscape are designed in a way that makes car at least look like the primary mode of transportation. And I think that probably needs to change in the long run. Of course, that's a very hard thing to do, especially when you have the city built up already. But I think that making sure that more space-efficient modes of transportation are the primary modes of transportation, that is something to strive for.
Thank you. The last one. Can you please give us a brief about your work for National Transport Investment Plan?
Yes, I spent quite a lot of my time on doing work for the national government, helping them construct the National Transport Infrastructure Investment Plan. There are many lessons to be learned there. I think that if I should pick one key lesson, it is that when you plan a national investment plan, the number of ideas and the number of opinions is so huge that you have no possible way to sort this out, just trusting your gut feeling. So the primary lesson, I think, would be to use some kind of objective evaluation scheme, something like social cost-benefit analysis, for example, where you try to weigh all the quantitative benefits in terms of travel time savings, in terms of traffic safety and reduced emissions, versus the cost of the things that you're doing. Because the number of proposed infrastructure investments might be, a couple of thousand, and no one can keep this in their head. So having some kind of objective ranking scheme of investments is probably the most important thing to do.
Thank you for your all answer and speech. But please wait to finish to the video. After that, we will give you a prize, okay? Efendim, oturum sponsorumuzu hemen sizlere iletmek istiyorum. İSBAK AŞ. Efendim kendilerine yakın işbirlikleri dolayısıyla ve destekleri dolayısıyla çok teşekkür ediyoruz. İSBAK'a ait bir videomuz var. Onu izleyeceğiz. Ardından Jonas Eliasson'a ödülünü takdim edeceğiz. Buyurunuz.
Modern matematiğin doğmasına öncülük eden ya da tarihte bilinen ilk robot tasarımını yapan bilim adamları kimlerdi? El-Cezeri ve Harezmi gibi büyük İslam alimleri ve mucitleri bugün bilinen matematik ve mühendislik bilgilerinin temellerini çok önceleri atmışlardı. Bu gerçekler bizi tarihsel bir yolculuğa çıkardı ve medeniyetimizin yükseliş ve ilerleyiş dönemini hatırlattı. Bu doğrultuda bugün kimlerden ilham almamız gerektiğini artık çok iyi biliyoruz. İlerlemenin simgesi Çintemani, akılla bilgiyi harmanlayan bir desendir. Çintemani, asırlar boyunca Türk geleneksel sanat ve süslemelerinde yer edinmiş bir formdur. Deseni oluşturan 3 daire, gönül gözü, akıl gözü ve dünya gözüdür. Bu simge, İslam biliminin ve Türk görsel kültürünün yükselişine eşlik etmiş bir desendir. Bugün dijital teknoloji çağının köklerini Çintamani deseninin özünde buluyoruz. Ve filizlendiğimiz kökleri hatırlayarak modern teknolojiyi bu kökler üzerine inşa ediyoruz. İSBAK, İstanbul'un her yerinde, İstanbul için yüksek teknoloji üretiyor ve şehrin aklı oluyor. İSBAK, yeni teknolojileri Türkiye ve dünya ile buluşturmaya devam edecek.
Evet, İSBAK'ın bu videosunun ardından ödül takdimine geçebiliriz. Mr. Jonas, please. Evet, değerli konuşmacımıza plaketini takdim etmek üzere İSBAK AŞ Genel Müdürü Sayın Muhammed Alyürü'yü sahneye davet ediyoruz efendim. Buyurunuz.